Okay, my clock says it is straight up 12 noon, and I've hit the record button, so we are good to go. I'd like to welcome everybody to the Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference webinar series. We continue today featuring Dr. Gail Carpenter with Iowa State University Extension, who will be describing nutritional approaches to decrease animal or calf uh, increase, decrease stress in calves. The Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference presents the latest research on nutrition and management of dairy cattle and has expanded the conference impact to the industry with the webinar series. Conference and webinars are a collaborative effort from Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, University of Illinois Extension, University of Minnesota Extension, and the University of Wisconsin Extension. Gail Carpenter is a state dairy extension specialist for Iowa State University, where she has a split appointment with teaching and research in addition to her extension role. A firm believer in the power of applied learning inside and outside of the classroom, she also coaches the Dairy Challenge team and serves on the National Dairy Challenge Board. Gail held positions in the University of Guelph, Bridgetown campus, and CSA Animal Nutrition in Dayton, Ohio, before beginning at Iowa State. As a Michigan native, Gail is a connoisseur of all things Midwest and can be found exploring the region's state and national parks when she's not at work. Please put your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the page, and Gail will choose when to address them during the presentation. As I always say, Gail, the podium is yours.
Well, thank you, Fred. Thank you for that introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. This was a breakout session that I presented at this last Fourth State Dairy Nutrition and Management Conference. And those of you who were there might remember that this was the session that my computer crashed in. So it's really great to have the opportunity to be able to present it again. And hopefully this time we'll be more successful. All right, I want to go ahead and start with setting the foundation or setting the stage for some of the information that we'll be talking about today. And I don't think this will come as a surprise to anybody who's here, but heifers are the foundation of the dairy herd. And making sure that we start them off on the right foot is really crucial when it comes to being able to make sure that our herd is successful, that our herd is financially sustainable, and not causing problems for us to fix later on down the road. Heifers are costly. They are not productive animals before they start lactating and have their first calf. Yet nearly 25% of a dairy's production costs are from the replacement program. So heifers do cost the farm a fair amount of money. They're also a bit of a black box. With our lactating cows, we often have daily touch points. You're milking them 2 or 3 times a day. If you're using a robotic milking system, you're going to get a lot of data points from those lactating cows. Heifers aren't always the first thing that we think about when it comes to our daily action items. And in fact, some of our heifers might be off-site. They might be at a different location. They might be on they might not even be raised by yourself. You might send them to a grower to be raised. So heifers are not always the first thing that come to mind when we're thinking about the daily things that need to be accomplished on a lot of dairies. And yet heifers are the future of the farm. So making sure that we have healthy, genetically advanced heifers that calve at the right maturity are the foundation for a productive dairy herd. So I think it's important to make sure, and I'm sure everybody on this call agrees, that making sure our heifers get started on the right foot is essential for making sure that we have a sustainable and productive dairy. A lot of this comes down to this whole idea that we need to grow enough heifers, and we also need to make sure that we are doing a good job of growing them. We're growing them well. a lot of time, I started thinking about this quite a bit when I attended the Discover conference a couple years ago on productive life. And this whole idea of call rate and what's the ideal call rate? Do we want to have longer productive life? Some argument was made that maybe if we had shorter productive life, we could get more heifers in, get more advanced animals in, make more voluntary rather than involuntary culling decisions, and spent a lot of time thinking about that. I think a lot of times getting that heifer rearing cost under control really starts with controlling morbidity and mortality of those heifers. So making sure that we are, again, not keeping heifers around that are struggling and setting the stage for them to be able to be successful. If our first lactation cows can't perform in the herd, early age at first calving won't pay off. So a lot of times when you hear these heifer discussions, we talk about what can we do to lower that age at first calving or find an optimal age at first calving. Not calving heifers in at 25, 26 months, but maybe getting more towards that 23, 24-month range. But if we are not growing heifers well, if we are not reducing that morbidity and mortality and creating a pool of healthy heifers to be the replacements for our dairy herds, having an earlier age at first calving is not going to pay off. And that all starts with those pre-weaned calves, getting that morbidity and mortality under control with those pre-weaned calves. It also starts with breeding the correct number of heifers, having the right inventory, not raising too many or too little. We also want to make sure that we maximize the number of heifers born at our farm that enter the herd as healthy 2-year-olds. Again, that starts with the pre-weaning stage, and so that's what we're going to focus on today. So if you don't remember anything from this presentation, remember this slide. This is an overview of the things that we're going to be talking about and the take-home messages that I want you to understand after our webinar today. To protect your return on investment, you need to pair sound management with nutrition strategies that reduce, not compound, common calf stressors. So making sure that we know that calves are stressed, use nutrition strategies to get the highest return on investment for those animals. We know that calves commonly experience several stressors that have implication for their performance as well as their return on investment. We know that we can use nutritional strategies to mitigate these stressors, but we can't stop with nutrition. We need to pair good nutrition with best management practices to mitigate stress in calves. So again, calves commonly experience several stressors that have implications for their performance and their return on investment. This is a partial overview of calf stressors. I really started getting interested in the idea of stress for calves when we started talking about beef on dairy calves, and a lot of the stressors that those calves experience, maybe more so or more frequently than calves who are being raised for replacement heifers. But these are stressors that all calves will experience. And again, this is only a partial overview. So it starts in that maternity pen, that calving pen, getting that set up right so that we can reduce stress in calves there. Calves are often transported at least once, if not more. And in that first transport event might actually be in that pre-weaning phase. Disbudding or castration, depending on the group of calves that you're dealing with, those are 1 to 2 more stressor events that will happen pre-weaning. And then weaning itself can be stressful as well. So I want to start by talking a little bit about that maternity pen and stress that calves might exhibit in that, or things that might stress a calf out in that calving pen. This was some data from 2007, so it's almost 20 years old now. Looking at calves that were born from hard calvings versus calves that were born from easier calvings, a dystocia score of 1 or 2. And one of the things that we see is that, especially if you include stillbirths, we see a dramatic difference in the survivability of those calves that were born from a hard calving. Even when you take the stillbirths out, if you look towards that 30 days of age, you can already see that those calves with a high calving score, those calves that were a harder pull, they have lower opportunity for survival than the calves who were easier pulls. So making sure that we have that maternity pen management, it pays for the cows themselves. It also pays for the calves there. So calves undergoing dystocia, so calves that were born from a hard pull, they are 2 to 15 times more likely to die in the perinatal period. So we know that it increases their risk of dying in the pre-weaning period there, or around birth would be perinatal, just a fancy term for around the time of birth. So things that we can do is make sure that we have a clean calving pen, making sure that we're not overcrowding our calving pen. That's overcrowding is going to increase the risk for stillbirth or increase the risk for a hard pull. Whatever strategy we're using, whether that's a just-in-time calving or whatever strategy we're using, make sure that we're sticking to our SOPs or standard operating procedures and making sure that we're managing that calving pen in a way that's low stress for the cow will also decrease the risk for the calf and the stress for the calf. Transportation stress is another common stressor that a lot of calves will experience. Transportation stress results in poor health outcomes, reduced performance, as well as economic impact, especially when we have younger calves. Transportation stress increases the risk of things such as BRD, bovine respiratory disease. Treatment itself for BRD costs $37 per calf, and a BRD-related death, according to this resource, would be about $400 a calf. And we know with the cost of calves right now, the way that calves are selling, the cost of replacements, that economic loss is even higher. Today, I am coming to you after having traveled up to World Dairy Expo last week. I was talking to Fred about this before folks started logging on, and I came back with a bit of respiratory disease myself. I've got a bit of the case of the cruds, as Fred called it. I'm sure a lot of cows are coming back after World Dairy Expo, and a lot of heifers are coming back after World Dairy Expo not feeling quite themselves, and maybe feeling a little bit like I am today. And that transportation stress does increase the opportunity for calves to actually have clinical signs of respiratory disease, which does in turn have an economic impact. Weaning stress is another. It was just for those who celebrate. It was just Mean Girls Day on October 3rd. Weaning stress, I kind of break into two main ideas here. There's the nutritional stress around weaning, but there's also the social stress around weaning. So when calves are weaned, they're going to be transitioning from a diet that contains a lot of liquid feed to a diet that contains very little or no liquid feed. And so that development of the rumen and the digestive system itself will be a cause of stress and transition for those animals. But at the same time, they'll also be experiencing some social stress. So they're going to be remixed with some different animals. They might be moving from individual housing into group housing, or pair housing into group housing, or they might be in group housing but moving into different groups and having to figure out their new social structure and where they fit in the pecking order at the same time. Kind of like Mean Girls in high school, right? Yes, so weaning itself is a stressor as well. And Barb, thank you for putting this in the note. If you're looking for more information on transport stress, Katie Kramer's work at CSU is very pivotal. And I do read a lot of her work, and she's done a lot of really great research into this whole idea of transportation stress. And so yes, thank you for that recommendation. That was that is 100% true. This was a study published. Oh, and Fred noted that Katie will be presenting in our Beef on Dairy Dialogue webinar on November 13th. So be sure to check that out with the I-29 Moo University group, which is part of the reason that I'm not spending a ton of time on transportation stress in this particular presentation. I tend to present this presentation when Katie is also going to be presenting. Or around the same time that Dr. Kramer will be presenting. So I tend to leave that, not take away any of her thunder there by talking about her own research. This paper published in 2024, I'm not going to walk through this graph or talk about everything that's on here. But the main take home point of these researchers was that weaning stress are complex and multivariate. There is a lot that goes into weaning stress. So I kind of simplified it by saying there's nutritional stress, but there's also social stress. That can be exacerbated or mitigated by weaning age, weaning duration, starter intake at weaning, whether or not you do a step down, and all of these things really tie in together. So weaning stress is a complicated thing. And we're going to talk about a couple strategies that are low-hanging fruit for some farms that are good options for dealing with weaning stress. But just know that weaning stress itself can be really complicated to study because there's so many things that play into it. And then again, I started getting really interested when I started looking more into beef on dairy crosses and best management and nutrition for beef on dairy crosses. And one of the things that we know is that these do experience some unique challenges that may not be as common in our replacement heifers. So if you take a look at the partial list I gave earlier about unique challenges for beef on dairy crosses, calving ease might be an additional stress that they experience around that maternity phase if we're not paying attention to using good calving ease bulls. This is not quite as common as it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago. But I know when I was out managing the Iowa State dairy, we had some beef semen that we got kind of from the bottom of the semen tank from our beef farm. And it was free and it was beef semen. So we threw it into the cows and it was not a low calving ease bull, right? And so I think a lot of our survey data demonstrates that our producers are looking for good calving ease bulls when they're breeding to beef semen. But it is important that we continue to do that. And if you're not doing that already, it's something important to consider. Colostrum might be a little bit of a question mark. Again, I think we're seeing the industry shift a little bit where we're having higher standards of colostrum feeding for our surplus dairy calves or our non-replacement dairy calves. But not everyone, if you have a choice whether to give your high quality colostrum to your replacement heifers versus your surplus calves, that might not always, they might not always receive the same level of colostrum care. They often do experience that transport stress. They're often picked up from the barn less than a week of age or even as wet calves and then sold either through a sale barn or sent to a calf raiser where they're often commingled with calves from everywhere. And even if you're doing a good job with your calves, that doesn't mean everybody there is too. So calf stressors tend to be even more exacerbated when it comes to dairy beef crosses. This is some data that we from dairy producers in Iowa that we collected last year, just some general survey data, just kind of demonstrating some of the things that I just talked about. Of the producers who replied or who answered this question, most of them, a little over half of them, market their calves at birth, a few of them at weaning, but the majority of folks who replied to this question are selling them as young calves. And then again, showing the major concern when choosing a beef sire, most folks said that calving ease was a major concern for them. And so this is something that people are thinking about, but hopefully it's something that everybody is at least considering while they're choosing beef sires. This was some survey data collected a couple years ago from our colleagues up in Wisconsin, looking at beef on dairy crossbreeding and calf management practices. I found this data to be somewhat encouraging, looking at colostrum feeding practices for beef on dairy calves. I think there's been a little bit of a conception for a while that dairy farmers don't feed a lot of colostrum to beef calves, but I think, like I said earlier, I think we're seeing a shift in that and industry wide, especially in farms that are taking advantage of our high beef on dairy cross prices in trying to produce these beef on dairy crosses, because you're getting 1,000, 1,200, 1,300 bucks a pop for these calves. They are an investment, and I think we're seeing a shift with dairy producers that are recognizing that. And so uh, survey respondents were asked how soon after birth colostrum is fed, and the majority of folks said within 6 hours. A couple said within 12 hours, but nobody replied after 12 hours. Again, this is survey response, so we didn't actually, or the my colleagues in Wisconsin didn't actually go back and confirm. But this is at least the procedure that's written down, that calves get colostrum soon after birth. And then the majority of them are getting at least 4 quarts of colostrum. About 2/3 of them are getting at least 4 quarts, with a few saying 3 or 2 quarts. Nobody said none, which was good. And then I think this was a couple people who said 1 quart of colostrum only. But I think that this shows that most dairy farmers, while there might be some room for improvement, most dairy farmers consider colostrum to be a high priority for their animals. And Barb said currently in the Texas Panhandle, they're looking at $1,400 for these beef cross calves. So yes, I think a lot of dairy farmers are recognizing the economic benefit of these beef crosses and this investment. So hopefully at this point, we've established nutritional strategies can mitigate, or that calves are stressed, right? Hopefully at this point, you recognize that there's a lot of opportunities for calves to be stressed out, and that there are economic impacts of these stressors on calves. I'm here to tell you that nutritional strategies can be used to help mitigate these stressors. We have a few different options here. When it comes to nutritional strategies, the main ones I'm going to talk about today, this could be a 4-hour presentation. Don't worry, it won't be. But the ones that I decided to focus on, because they are low-hanging fruit for some people, would be colostrum, plane of nutrition, step-down weaning, starter, and supportive additions. So we'll start by talking about colostrum. I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I do think colostrum is so important that it's worth emphasizing over and over again. Depending on which dairy management class you took when you were in undergrad, you may have heard the 3 Qs, you may have heard the 5 Qs. Technically, the 5th Q is not a Q at all. It's squeaky clean, so it's actually 4 Qs plus a C. If you hear my colleague Philip Jardin ever talk about this topic, he'll argue that there should be a T in there too for temperature. And I think it just doesn't always make the list because it doesn't fit into our Q Q network here. So, but yes, I would add temperature of colostrum onto this list as well. So we're looking at quality, quantity, getting it to the animal quickly, quantifying the quality of the colostrum, and then that squeaky clean, making sure that we have our cleanliness under control, making sure all equipment for harvest, storage, and delivery are sanitized for each calf. And we have to remember that it is a food product, right? And calves have a naive immune system. This is how we're getting that passive immunity to those calves. So they really don't have a lot of immunity to be able to fight back if we are not giving them squeaky clean colostrum and making sure that we're not using those sanitary practices. Using heat treating colostrum is a great option, not pasteurizing, because pasteurizing will get the technical definition, will get it too hot, but heat treating would be our technical term for that. And then making sure that colostrum is being cooled as quickly as possible too, even if we aren't heat treating, so that it's not sitting at that perfect temperature for bacterial growth. But I'm not going to sit and talk through all of these points individually right now. But we do know that calves that get good quality colostrum, they do have less risk of disease. So this survivability curve here, you show these calves with the high, excellent quality colostrum versus calves that have good or fair or even poor colostrum. We see a dramatic difference in the ability of these calves to be able to stay healthy. And so we know, again, this is kind of back to basics. And I think sometimes people hear me talk and they say, "Oh, I know the colostrum's important, but um, it's so important that I think it's worth talking about pretty much every time I talk about calves." Colostrum also is important for mitigating transportation stress. So these calves either had high or low colostrum supplement, and they had two different transport events. Um, and you can see a dramatic impact of the proportion of calves. So this is low colostrum. These calves had a much higher risk of having a loose manure if they had lower quality colostrum than calves who didn't. And so, yes, colostrum is something that I talk about over and over again, but it is something that does predict better health outcomes if we do have colostrum management under control. And as we discussed, those health outcomes do have economic outcomes as well. So moving on and talking a little bit more about plaintiff nutrition. Plaintiff nutrition gets a little bit tricky because if you talk about high versus low plaintiff nutrition, it turns out that many people have different ideas of what that actually means. And what we used to talk about as a high plane of nutrition 10 or 15 years ago might not be what we think of anymore as a high or low plane of nutrition or as a high plane of nutrition. I think we've started pushing the envelope a little bit more when it comes to the volume of milk replacer that we can feed calves. And we've seen a little bit of, I think, an evolution in the industry where we're feeding more biologically normal, you might call it, levels of milk replacer, especially with calves that are being fed on robots or auto feeders that aren't being fed large meals of milk replacer throughout or whole milk throughout the day. And so when you start looking into the plane of nutrition literature, it turns out that we might see some differences in experimental design that might make these studies a little bit more squishy or a little harder to interpret. So some of the examples of differences you'll see is that some of these studies will focus on Jerseys, others will focus on Holstein calves or mixed breed. Milk replacer composition, so the protein and fat might vary widely across some of these different experiments. Dry matter intake targets will vary quite widely when it comes to our definition of a high or low plane of nutrition. And Kevin, that's a great question. Kevin wants to know if I recommend high or low plane of nutrition. I'm going to walk you through a long journey before I tell you what I recommend there, Kevin. I'm going to set you up with the controversy before I plug my opinion there. Feeding method. So programs will range from fixed milk replacer volumes to ad libitum, or they might call it biologically normal intake. So feeding method can be kind of all over the place. This is, I think, and I'll just kind of give you a peek ahead, step down strategy, I really think is an important caveat when it comes to whether high or low plane of nutrition works well. Whether or not we have that step down, I think is pretty critical, and how long the pre-weaning period actually is. So if you're weaning at 6 weeks, having a high plane of nutrition, I think, is going to be harder than if you're doing it at 8 weeks or more. And then weaning protocols will also significantly affect outcomes as well. And then post-weaning diets. The diets that these calves are going on to vary tremendously in their energy levels and how much concentrate's included in dry matter intake targets. And so making cross-study comparisons can be pretty difficult. Generally speaking, when we talk about a high versus a low plane of nutrition, the pros that we think about is that if you have a higher plane of nutrition, you're going to have higher growth pre-weaning. There's been some data out there, and I'll talk about some of that data a little bit here in a bit, that see better growth pre-weaning, increased milk in the first lactation. So kind of seems like case closed there. But then if you look at a high plane of nutrition, you might also see decreased starter intake. You might see a post-weaning slump, as well as higher fecal scores. So you might see some nutritional scours. This was a study that we did, and there was more in this study than just the high and low plane of nutrition. But I kind of aggregated the data here just with the calves with the high plane of nutrition and calves with the low plane of nutrition. Um, these calves were offered about 4 kilos of a 13.5 solids milk replacer solution twice daily, and low calves were offered at 2.5 kilos of the same solution until weaning at 56 days. In this particular experiment, we did do an abrupt weaning. So we gave high and low plane of nutrition, and then at 8 weeks, boom, they were done. They did not have any step down period. And you can see pretty predictably that starter intake was quite a bit higher in our calves with the low plane of nutrition, especially as they get close to weaning. By 2 weeks after weaning, the high calves had caught up in starter intake to the low calves. And then if you take a look at the body weight of these calves, calves with a high plane of nutrition predictably did grow better. They did have higher body weight than calves with a low plane of nutrition. However, you see that they kind of stagger here a little bit at that 8 week, and while the low plane of nutrition keeps going up. And so by about 10 weeks, the low plane of nutrition had caught up on body weight for those calves. Um, and so this is a pretty classic example of what happens if you feed a high plane of nutrition without any sort of step down protocol. However, we do see that high plane of nutrition does have an impact on healing. So this was a 2022 study published in the Journal of Dairy Science. I'll set up again, there's a lot of variation in what the calves experience, or how experiments are set up. But we have a 2x2 factorial where calves either had a biologically normal or a limited plane of nutrition. And so they called biologically normal 15 liters per day versus limited 6 liters per day. And then they did an additional NSAID or no additional NSAID after disbudding. And then they looked at the calves' ability to heal after disbudding. Calves were fed in this experiment 5 times a day by a calf rail on an acidified milk replacer, and you can see some of the information about the milk replacer right there. And so this is looking at this panel A is looking at the wound diameter, and it's looking at the limited plane versus the biologically normal plane. And you can see there's actually a difference in the diameter of the wound and how quickly that wound closes up, where calves on a biologically normal plane had faster shrinking of that wound diameter, as well as the wound depth there too. So providing calves with that biologically normal plane of nutrition did help them in that healing process after disbudding in this particular experiment. This was a 2015 study done on Jersey calves looking at plane of nutrition and immune function. So the low plane in this particular study received 409 grams per day of dry matter versus 610. And they did a bit of a step up, the 610 and 735 grams per day. The lower, so the 610 in week 1 and then 735 grams in week 2 to 6. And then they received a salmonella challenge. And they did see that the calves on the high plane of nutrition after that challenge, they did increase their starter intake faster. And they saw some different benefits there when it comes to immune function. They're looking at TNF alpha, oxidative burst, and some more of these immune function outcomes. So these calves had better immunity when they were on a higher plane of nutrition. Now, a lot of this whole idea, some of the controversy, I guess, around what the best plane of nutrition is comes down to we have this, I don't know if you want to call it a dogma, but there's this idea that if we feed more milk, we get more milk, right? You feed calves more milk pre-weaning, you're going to get more milk post-weaning. And I think there's a lot more to it than that, right? So I think there's been quite a few analyses done out there on whether it's a direct, like, feed more milk, you make more milk, or whether there's more involved. And it shouldn't surprise too many people that, hey, maybe it's actually a little bit complicated. So this was one example of one of these other analyses. This was done by Hugh Chester Jones in 2017. And they looked at about 3,000 Holstein calves from 3 different commercial dairies up in Minnesota. And they looked at body weight and average daily gain at 6 weeks and starter intake at 8 weeks. And both of those increased first lactation milk and milk components. So it wasn't just the body weight, but it's also that starter intake at 8 weeks as well. And if you think about back to the classic, the classic response that you see with a high plane of nutrition, starter intake is higher in calves that have a low plane of nutrition. So it's not just about getting a lot of milk replacer into calves. It's about getting a lot of calories into those calves and making sure that we're getting good rumen development with adequate starter intake. There's also a lot of variation around here. Just take a look at this graph right here. This is a scatter showing the correlation between 6-week average daily gain and 305-day milk yield and first lactation. And you'll notice there's a bunch of spread around there, right? It's not a super tight correlation. Things like season can impact that as well. And there's a lot of management factors that can impact that. So plane of nutrition and starter intake, I think it kind of comes down to how can we take advantage of the benefits of a high plane of nutrition? We saw it increases wound healing. We saw it improves immunity. How can we take advantage of some of those benefits without compromising starter intake and rumen development? And that leads into my next point here when I talked about some of the options for nutritional strategies. Plane of nutrition really, in my opinion, has to be tied in very closely to using a step-down weaning protocol. Step-down protocols can mitigate some of those downsides, some of a high plane of nutrition. In this study, done up at by Mike Steele in 2017, they used an abrupt weaning versus a gradual weaning. And they started that at 48 days of life. So the gradual had a 12-day step down, abrupt had a 0-day step down. A 12-day step down, I think anymore is going to be a little long, unless you're on an auto feeding system. But I think it's going to kind of be a bit long for a lot of people. But they just looked at just simply doing a little bit of a step down before 12 days before they hit that 48-day mark. So you can see here in this panel A what that milk replacer intake looked like. So they did a step down at 36 days of age and then another step down before they got to 48 days. After that step down happened, all of a sudden they're getting less milk replacer, starter intake goes up. They did see a decline in energy intake when they did that first step down, but they had caught up by the 48 days. And there was a little bit of a stutter, I guess, there in growth after that step down intake. So that begs the question, I mean, 36 days of age starting to take back some of that milk replacer, that does seem, in my opinion, quite young. And so how long should these step down processes take? This is looking at calves on auto feeders. These calves were weaned at 41 days. These calves were weaned at about 6 days of age. And so if you think about a 22-day step down, and this is where I think some of this data gets kind of complicated. These calves, if they're being stepped down at 22 days of age, they're like 3 weeks old by the time you first are taking them back on milk replacer. And this is some of the data that gets pointed at when you say, well, how long should they be stepped down? I think that the answer to that question is going to vary quite a bit depending on what age you're weaning your calves at. And so they looked at, again, 22-day step down, beginning at 19 days of age, 10-day, 4-day, or 0-day. And what you can see there, pretty predictable milk intakes. That is, going to be dependent very much based on which treatment they're on. Starter intake starts to go up once these calves are doing a step down. However, the 22-day step down, that actually started even before calves were really eating starter. So to me, making sure starting that step down before starter intake has had a chance to catch up doesn't really make a ton of sense to me. And not too surprisingly, I guess, on this this very long step down, the 22-day step down, um, we see a reduced body weight. And again, I don't think that's necessarily because you have a long step down or just because if you have such a long step down, you have to start at such a young age. But I've rambled a lot at you and showed you a lot of graphs here. And the take home that I want you to understand is that adequate starter intake is a must. So making sure that you're doing that step down in a way that's encouraging calves to eat starter once they've actually started to eat that starter, that's really important. I know, and a lot of it will depend on what your protocols are for your dairy in the first place. Again, if you're on auto feeders, it's really easy to do a gradual step down protocol. If you're feeding twice a day, maybe it's just that for the week before calving or the week before weaning, you back off and you're only feeding calves once a day. Something simple like that to kind of encourage that starter intake to catch up in those high plane of nutrition calves. So Kevin, to answer your question, whether I recommend a high or a low plane of nutrition, I do believe that a high plane of nutrition is good for calves. But I think you need to pair it with a step down protocol so that you are promoting that starter intake by weaning. That was my short answer after the long answer. And that ties right back in to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is starter intake. This is a slide I showed already, but I want to draw your attention back in to this idea that a starter intake at 8 weeks does correlate to higher first lactation milk and milk component yields. Kevin says, yes, that makes sense because you see big crashes without. Absolutely. If you are not making sure those calves are eating enough starter, they will stop growing. They will crash out after weaning. Some characteristics of a good starter. We need to be promoting starter intake. We can tweak the plate of nutrition. We can tweak the amount of milk replacer being fed to encourage starter intake. But there's other things that we should be doing too to encourage calves to eat starter. It needs to be palatable. So don't let it get like wet and mushy and moldy in there. Make sure that it's frequently refreshed. You can consider using flavor agents or having it bound together with molasses. Textured versus pelleted, I think either one can work if the pellet quality is good. If you have poor quality pellet, a softer pellet with more fines, that is not going to you're going to have some issues there with calves. Calves have not wanting to eat it because the fines will get caught in their throat and caught in their nose. It's so keeping less than 5 to 10% fines to me is the important part. A texturized starter works really well when it comes to convincing calves to eat, getting that rumen development. But pelleted can also work if pellet quality is good. Starter intake is the primary factor determining ruminal development, dry feed intake. So making sure that we're getting that early start on that rumen development is so important. One thing, this was an interesting little study published in 2020 in the Journal of Dairy Science. One simple thing that can be done to encourage starter intake is to consider where the starter is being placed. And so in this was calves fed on a calf rail system. And in some of these pens, the solid feed was put in the middle next to, and they called this the adjacent treatment pen. It was put next to the milk replacer feed, and all of these, the water bucket is on the outside. But in some of these, the solid feed was placed next to the milk bucket, and some of it was placed on the opposite side as the milk bucket. When starter was placed next to the milk source, they found that calves consumed more solid feed and more milk during the pre-weaning phase. They also did drink more water, even though the water was on the opposite side. They spent more time consuming solid feed and had greater average daily gain during the pre-weaning phase. So a simple choice to make could be putting solid feed next to your milk bucket or your calf rail, whatever you're feeding calves on. If you have fed calves before, they get kind of sloppy. So that might come back to the whole idea of Making sure that you're refreshing that feed daily, because if they're sticking their nose in a milk bucket and then sticking their nose in a starter bucket, you might have some of that cross contamination. It might get a little bit soggy, but potentially some opportunity here to see increased starter intake. This is we did some research, and apparently my copy paste job was not particularly great because these graphs are kind of a mess right now. I apologize for that. But this was a study that another grad student of mine did. We looked at early life nutritional impacts on beef, on dairy calves. They received two different types of starter pre-weaning, and then either a high forage or a low forage receiver diet. These are on beef on dairy crosses. Um, the high starch was not particularly high, about 26% starch. The low starch was low, about 16% starch. We did not see what these graphs that you can't see very well are showing, is that there was not really an impact on growth in these two calves. Calves with the high starch starter did tend to eat a little bit more, especially closer to weaning. But when we paired those lower starch diets pre-weaning with the TMR, or a higher roughage diet in the receiving phase in these beef on dairy calves, we did see a dramatic reduction in liver abscesses post or at finishing. So we do think there might be something to maybe feeding some lower starch diets to these calves. Hopefully we'll have a chance to do some more studies to take a look at why maybe that's happening. However, one of the biggest impacts that we saw from this, and this kind of goes back to what I talked about at the beginning of this presentation as well. One of the biggest impacts we saw was not so much the starter itself, but was the health of the calves. So calves that had 2 or more respiratory events had a 29-pound reduced carcass weight and a $91 reduction in their overall return. So the differences we saw based on nutrition were there, but relative to the differences that we saw based on the health of those calves, those were actually the biggest differences. And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about potential supportive additions. Some things that might boost overall calf health that we can do with maybe some additives or other products that we can purchase or might be included in your milk replacer would be extended colostrum feeding or feeding transition milk. Either some farms might add colostrum replacer to the milk or feed some sort of transition milk. I think there's a lot of emphasis around, or a lot of research going on with that extended colostrum feeding that demonstrates it can be beneficial, but there's a lot of different things that can work for a lot of different people, right? And so that could be its own kind of talk on its own. I think the main take home I want you to get out of that is that extended colostrum feeding is worth exploring because there is some good data that shows it can be worthwhile. Supplements, probiotics, prebiotics, use lactobacillus or Saccharomyces cerevisiae, like looking at some of those probiotics often included within a milk replacer product, or prebiotics as well. These have been shown to have some positive impacts on calf growth. And then electrolytes, feeding electrolytes to rehydrate calves, especially after transport stress or if they're dealing with scours or some other digestive issue. When I'm sick, Pedialyte or Body Armor, some good electrolytes really help me feel like I'm fighting off an infection and feeling better. And it's the same with calves too. Do not feed electrolytes instead of a milk replacer if you're supporting stressed calves. They still need those calories to be able to perform well. So don't replace milk replacer with electrolytes if calves are transport stressed, for example. And it's probably worth considering feeding it at a different time than milk replacer, just to make sure that osmolality isn't being messed with too much. And then lastly, I think it's also good to note that you can't outfeed bad management. So you have to pair good nutrition with best management practices to mitigate stress in calves. So coming back to that idea, the idea of maternity management that I started this presentation with, I have I've used this meme here in a couple different presentations because I think a lot of times as a nutritionist, if you have a dairy that's dealing with transition cow issues, your first instinct is to go straight to what does the pre-fresh diet look like? What does that fresh cow diet look like? Really focus on what's the mineral balance, what's the energy, what are the predictions on those diets. And there's this giant event that happens right in between those two diets, which is maternity management, or the maternity barn. Calving happens in between the pre-fresh and the post-fresh diet. And if calving doesn't go right, you're going to have transition cow problems as well as calf problems. Um, so paying attention to calving supervision and intervention, not intervening too soon on cows that are calving, making sure that we're intervening as needed and that personnel are trained on when intervention is appropriate. Um, Technology can be a great resource for calving surveillance to make sure that we are catching cows that do need intervention, but that we're not over intervening. Minimizing that stress, minimizing overcrowding of the maternity area I mentioned earlier, and then maintaining cleanliness of the environment and equipment. For baby calves, housing and environment, this could again be a whole 4 hour lecture in and of itself. But making sure that we're minimizing both heat stress and cold stress, maintaining appropriate bedding and air quality and ventilation, providing water both in hot and cold weather. It's a great way to improve rumen development and help with that starter intake. Be conscious of social impacts on calves. So whether you're pair housing, whether you're group housing, whether you're individually housing and then mixing, being aware of how those differences in social structure can impact calf stress around weaning, and then avoid stacking stressors. Um, don't castrate, disbud, wean, and mix all in the same day, right? If you know that you're gonna have you're gonna have to castrate calves, try to space that out so it's not right before weaning, for example. Or don't wean and mix calves on the same day. Don't give them that nutritional and social stress there on the same day. So try and spread those stressors out so that you're not stacking them on top of each other. Again, those calf stressors I went over are just a partial overview, but they're common among most calves in our dairy industry and in our beef industry as well, especially as beef on dairy crosses become a bigger part of the beef industry. So I'll start with some action items, or I'll end with some action items, things that you can do tomorrow. If you're working with dairies or if you manage a dairy, tomorrow you can start by making sure all of your colostrum protocols are up to par. Make sure that your calves are hitting adequate starter intake before weaning. Um, you can move the starter next to the milk source to promote that starter intake and make sure that you're keeping stressed calves hydrated. Um, Over the next couple months, you can consider gradual weaning if you're using a high plane of nutrition. You can audit your maternity routines and make sure that your maternity routines are where they need to be, and consider how you can avoid stacking those stressors in those calves. So that's the end of my presentation. I see a couple questions popping up in the chat. This is my email address if anybody wants to reach out. But yeah, we think we have a few minutes here for questions. Um, Kevin asks, do you think we over and underfeed during changes in seasonal temperature changes? I don't see a lot of nutritional changes recommended in calves. Um, I guess, Kevin, and I think we're a small enough group that you might be able to unmute if you want to clarify that a little bit more. I do think it makes sense to maybe feed more calories in cold stress. Especially calves tend to cold stress calves tend to maybe have some more opportunity. We cold stress calves a little bit more easily than we heat stress calves. Um, and so I don't know if you have uh, other clarification to add to that question there.
My thought is I agree with you in the wintertime, but I see a lot of feed companies in particular feed the same groceries in the summer when the calves probably don't need that much and don't change the formulation whatsoever. So it's costly. It's very costly to do
Hmm.
that. So I was just wondering what you thought about that. Probably not a big deal.
I'm I'm okay with getting more calories in milk generally. I see some people on the call who might disagree with me. But I'm okay. I'm okay if we give calves more calories in milk as long as we're making sure we still hit that starter intake.
Okay, well, that makes sense.
We have other questions. I think Gail hit it on the head. We're a small group. Just unmute and ask the question, or you can type it either way.
And I also looking around at some of the names we have on the screen here. I know there's a lot of people with a lot of calf experience, um, and uh, would also welcome any of them to answer any questions.
Got
And
one
now maybe
question.
we'll get no questions because nobody wants to be called on. Yeah.
Here we go.
Barb suggests a calf milk audit. Yes, do that. Those are also fantastic. I should put that on my action items as well. Osmolality is something that is really easy to screw up when it comes to mixing milk replacer and making sure you can use your Brix refractometer to monitor your solids and your milk replacer if you're reconstituting milk too. It's really easy to not be super consistent, even within a batch, right? You might get might not be um, you might not be consistent in temp or consistent in the solids that you've mixed together. So yeah, pull out that Brix and take a look at and your temperature, your thermometer, and monitor some of those things, which I think goes to Juan's question.
Okay, another question that came in is, are the differences in ingredients in step down starters, do you see any change in ruminant development
Step down starters.
or in starters when you're stepping down from in the weaning process? Are there some grain ingredients that you promote above others?
Um, so generally when I'm talking about a step down, I'm talking about milk, liquid
Replacing.
feed, right?
Yep.
Um, I don't know if I'm too excited to be changing around a bunch of ingredients in the starter at the same time as the milk replacer and making it more complicated. Um, I don't know if that answers the question or not,
But just
but
that I'm assuming, there's some starters that are high in oats or high in barley, high in corn. Is there one grain that you see works better, that's palatable for the calf and does a good job growing it?
I'm gonna give a non-answer, right? I'm gonna give a it depends extension answer. I think that different farms will have different favorites, right? And cows do not have requirements for feed. They have requirements for nutrients, and calves are the same, right? And so much of a just like a TMR, so much of a starter feed is going to depend on what else is there. It's going to depend on what's economical for your region. It's going to depend on what else is included, right? If you have a texturized starter with some molasses in it, then you might be more forgiving of maybe less palatable feeds. So I think if it's working for you, keep doing it.
Very good.
Or as we say in extension, it depends.
Okay, I'm not seeing another question. So then I get to go back to one of my pet topics. What your second or third slide, you talked about the mature cow weight. You want the heifers at 85% of mature cow weight. Okay, let's discuss that again. How do we determine that?
Okay, I knew you were going to ask me that. So yes, so when we're talking about those targets when it comes to mature body weight, it's really important that we have a good estimate of our mature body weight. So there's a few different ways to do that. you want to get a somewhat accurate representation of calves in their third or fourth lactation, in mid lactation, and you want healthy animals, right? So you don't want animals that are too fresh, and you don't want animals that are too late in lactation because they might be over thin or over conditioned. Using cull cow weights is also not ideal because they tend to have the same problem. Either they're DMBs who aren't making milk anymore, or they are lame and can't get to the feed bunk and are dropping a lot of condition, right? So when we're identifying what our mature body weight is for our herd, which influences a lot of things, including our target for age at first calving, making sure that you have cows in their third and fourth lactation, mid lactation, that are healthy.
Very good.
Scales work great if you want to just load a few cows into a trailer, drive the trailer over and get an average that way, versus doing individual scales. A lot of robots will have the scales built in already. Tape weights also work fine. They're not the most accurate thing in the world, but they work okay. They're better than nothing.
Okay, we'll
Just make
wait.
sure you don't get kicked in the head.
We'll wait just a second and see if Bike Alley
Oh,
has.
Barb, well, you should have given this talk for me. You're just some great ideas. Another action item to consider is water availability. Yes, and I know you're down in Texas, and so you don't have to deal with water freezing as much, or probably do sometimes, but not as often as we have to deal with water freezing. Keep water in front of calves. Right next door to me is Dr. Ranga Apuhami. He's done some great research that has shown that water intake improves dry matter intake. It improves rumen development and their rumen function. So it actually improves like NDF digestibility, for example. So it's good for rumen function. It's also, I think you're probably going to see some, especially down where you are, some issues with health and heat stress on those calves if they're not getting enough water. So yes, keeping water in front of your calves. I know it's going to be a pain in the butt once we start freezing up here in the more northern parts of the country, but making sure that water is available for those animals is so important. They do get frozen waters here, just not as many days. Yes. I know it does freeze in Texas, but maybe just not as often.
Very good. Well, Gail, thank you very much for the information you shared. I want to make the folks aware that the next four-state webinar is scheduled for November 25th with Caitlin Goldsmith, who will be addressing navigating seasonal changes in colostrum yield. And remember, I will send an email out to everyone who registered once the webinar is archived and available. And it will also include a evaluation. And I strongly ask, beg, plead for you to go ahead and do that evaluation. That's how we can continue to make these webinars better. So at this point, thank you, Gail, again, and we will go ahead and end today's webinar.
Thank you, everyone.